Hey everyone, welcome to No Pseudonyms Review Crew. This is episode 41, and I'll be your host for today, Kevin Gossett, the LA Reviews editor for NoPro. Today we have
Noah Nelson, publisher and host of the No Proscenium podcast.
And Laura Hess, NoPro's arts editor.
So today we're going to be talking about the Without Walls Festival, but before we get into that, we're going to have a quick reminder about book club that's coming up on May 17th in the Discord at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Blake and Patrick will be leading a discussion on The Night Circus by Aaron Morgenstern. So you have a little less than a month to get that read, and come with your questions, discussions in the Discord. So I think it'll be a fun episode. I am looking forward to actually starting that book. I need to do that. So now we're going to dive into the episode proper. Talk about Without Walls, which is a festival in La Jolla, California, which is near San Diego. It started.
It's actually. Sorry to correct you. Should have done this in
no.
the things. It is in San Diego. It's from the La Jolla Playhouse, which is part of UCSD. But this time out, it was in fact in San Diego at Arts District Liberty Station, a converted naval training center on a little islet that is in the flight path of San Diego International Airport, which is important to note.
Yes.
Does that factor into the shows? In the
in sort of, yes.
Interesting. All right, so this is a festival that brings together creators from around the world for interactive and site-specific theater specifically. I didn't actually attend, but Laura and Noah did, so I'm going to kick it to them for kind of their overall thoughts on the festival. So I'm actually kicking to Laura first because this is your first time attending in person.
Yeah, so I will say that I have done a couple of shows over the past 2 years during the pandemic. They La Jolla Playhouse did, I think, an incredible job transferring or sort of pivoting to digital WOW. That's what they called it, the Digital Without Walls Festival. And I did some performances through that. And I thought that those were absolutely fantastic. So this was my first time actually going down to San Diego and experiencing Without Walls in capacity in person, in that in-person capacity. So it was definitely there were slated to be 24 performances. And so it was a really packed weekend jaunt down from LA, definitely very doable, but you wound up kind of doing, I don't know, Noah, how much, I imagine you fell into this as well, but kind of the like Tetrising of all the programming and trying to figure out how I could pack in as much as possible, because there are both public performances and then there are ticketed performances as well. So trying to make as much of that happen as possible was a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, that was definitely, I mean, I had the luxury of sort of the press office was like, oh, this is what you think you should do. And I was like, cool, I don't have to think. With like that's me being transparent. Like, I've been going to WOW since 2015. It used to be a biannual. I believe it started in 2013. That's what Kevin's got in the show notes. Thank you, Kevin. And I've been going. I went to the 2015 when it was on the UCSD campus and in environs. I went to the one that was. I went to a few of the pieces when it was. It kind of did a distributed thing. 1 year, didn't have a central location so much. I think I only caught like one or two things that year. And then in 2019 was its first year at Arts District Liberty Station. And they also did a pop-up in 2021. So, this is my third full and my fourth WOW event in general. There is a lot. There's also the balance of the festival. It isn't a pure No Proscenium joint. Right? Like, it isn't all immersive interactive. It isn't all super detailed, site specific, site responsive. There's a lot of public performances. There's particularly in the Liberty Station years, there's been a lot of stuff geared for kids, just sort of spectacle stuff. And there's always been some degree of spectacle in it. This year's mix, there was a bit more technical stuff going on with like projection. They was starting to kind of get back into having things be inside. And there was a lot of there was a lot of what I would kind of feel like, like smaller, definitely more festival like pieces. And it's always funny because WOW invites international artists, and you'll have these like incredibly polished pieces. Like this year, Le Boule was incredibly polished, and it's from a Canadian company called Corpus. And then you'll have stuff from, more local artists that is like really experimental on the immersive side. This year that was represented by Mr. and Mischief, 40 Watts from Nowhere. We'll get into that later. And then you'll have stuff from sort of like local San Diego artists who are experimenting with the form. And, that's stuff like Standing on Her Shoulders, or is it On Her Shoulders We Stand? I don't have that note in front of me, but that's what I wrote up in the diary today. And so it's this mix. It's a little bit of like a local San Diego public arts festival. It's a little bit of, the biggest institutional art festival we have that focuses on immersive theater at all. So it's a really unique beast. And Liberty Station is a fairly dynamic location, but as I alluded to, it has some serious issues with it. And I note that this is their last year at Liberty Station, which, I'll miss easy access to the Stone Brewing Company, but I will not miss being in the flight path of San Diego International Airport.
Yes.
There's plenty of breweries down in San Diego, though.
Yeah, but I like Stone,
Anyway.
okay?
All right.
They're my thing. They're my thing, Kevin. Stone's my thing.
So you mentioned that it was fairly unique, and I think the public performances are maybe kind of a place to start here in terms of, I think, things that are not normally open to kind of public spaces with immersive art. So I know there are a few of those. Do you want to dive into some combination of monuments, TransMythical, and ants?
Why, yes, we shall. I'll start. We'll sandwich this one with Monuments. Monuments is a piece by Craig Walsh. He's an Australian artist, and what he does is he takes these video portraits of usually 3 individuals. I think it's like the standard format that are somehow, I believe, tied to the area that the piece is going to be projected in, and then they project those portraits onto trees. So they get these big faces looking out at you from trees. They're moving a little bit. They're not super hyperkinetically animated. They're just there and present and just sort of looking at the world, and you're looking at them, and it's just stunning and beautiful. And it's supposed to be about, the quotes around aims to challenge traditional expectations of public monuments and the selective history represented in our civic spaces. And that totally nails that. But what it also does is it's just gorgeous and just touches something that's just kind of beyond. I don't know if it hit that way for you, Laura.
It absolutely did. And I think that in addition to what you just said about, which is obviously a key foundational part of the piece, challenging what we view as monuments, how we make those decisions, what is projected in our society in terms of, an example of some sort of excellence or something to aspire to. There is, so as Kevin cited, this was this was part of the public programming. So this was just, it started around sundown for visibility reasons. And then you didn't need a ticket. This was free. You could swing by, you could stay as long as you wanted. And there was I think one of the challenges in terms of programming for a festival like this is you're hoping to sort of hit like all of the notes if you can. And so for some people, they want a lot of interactivity. They maybe want, high energy, high intensity. For some people, maybe not so much. And then there are people that want both. And this offered a really, really wonderful end of that spectrum where it's not interactive per se, but because of the movement of these projections, which again, the scale is an enormous part of this, pun intended. And it's incredibly evocative. And to look at the subtle movements that Noah's describing, I mean, it actually felt, so there were parts too of how the trees are incorporated. One tree had kind of this area where the internal trunk, the branches were really exposed. And the way that actually opened up part of one of these, the women's faces, So it looked almost like this kind of scar on her face. There's this interplay also between these natural elements, especially at this scale, and these women and how their video capture, what this sort of low level of expression is. It was incredibly haunting and beautiful. It was so mesmerizing. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
So I didn't see the piece, but I'm quickly Googling it while you talk. You mentioned the movement too, and the thing I'm looking at is the face is moving, but the wind is moving the trees, which adds this additional element,
Yes.
which looks really cool to me.
Yes.
It's
as
great.
I'm watching a
It's great.
snippet
I'll send you
of
some
it.
videos, Kevin. So,
But so is there like an actual performance aspect to it, or
No,
it really is
no.
just kind of like an art installation
It's an
on
installation.
trees?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the latter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And that's and just for everyone who's listening to No Pro, we're into that. Like it doesn't always need to have a performative element, right? This is a thing we're into. This is a thing we are deeply, deeply into.
And I think also what I want to highlight with this is that because we will come back around to this point, or at least I will come back around to this point with later productions. So as you're saying, Noah, it doesn't have to do everything. And what this does, it does so wonderfully well.
Yes.
And so it's about doing this one thing that I think feels very simple because it is so well crafted and it is so beautifully done. It is not trying to check off every box, and it completely delivers on what it is presenting and then some. To me, it was definitely one of the highlights of the entire festival.
We should probably keep blasting through these.
Yes.
So you also did TransMythical, which I did not do. You caught a little bit of this.
Yeah, so this was another public. This was a kind of a parade or a processional, and it was another public performance. And it just so happened, and I was delighted that this happened, that in between on Sunday I did 40 Watts from Nowhere, and I did 1,000 Ways Part 3 in Assembly. And in between these two, I just happened to get lucky, and this processional of TransMythical was literally in my path. And so TransMythical is by the Animal Cracker Conspiracy. Great name. And so these are San Diego based artists. And so this is a hybrid puppet company, and they are invested in, these are their words, invested in peering under the surface of things and pushing the boundaries of kinetic performance. And I will say about this, this was very large scale. In terms of these puppets, there weren't a ton of them. You did have some dancers who were ground level, who were costumed, but then you also had these larger scale puppets. So they're performers on stilts, for example, on bicycles. And their costuming and the design of these different puppets and creatures was, again, beautifully crafted, very colorful. And then the way that they interacted with everyone around. There's kids and families, and that's wonderful. But there were some that approached me, and I was delighted to be included. And so I didn't really know a lot about this particular performance, but it's billed as a celebratory procession of magic, imagination, and inclusivity. It was apparently a 50-minute procession. Again, I only caught a few minutes. So,
yeah. But you don't need to watch like 50 minutes of a procession.
You don't. And this is exactly, again, this is another example of exactly what the festival did really well.
Yeah.
So you can catch these kinds of things in between and route to something else. And you can have these moments of surprise and delight by these local artists and performers who do really beautiful work. And you can also have some agency over, okay, how long do I want to spend with this? Because this one is free and available to me in the moment.
Yeah, that was kind of my experience of Ants, which is Polyglot Theater's sort of theatrical game. It's aimed at children and families, really at children. You have these three performers dressed up in these pretty good ant costumes, right? Like they're the bodies kind of rolling off the back, and they're carrying around these little bags. They've got all these like pillowy bags. In the fiction of the game, they are breadcrumbs. And there's these piles of them, and the ants are kind of picking them up and moving them around and kind of like lining them up. And the children just wordlessly are invited to kind of help the ants. Well, if you've ever watched like 40 children try to help something, it is pure chaos. And so,
Like swarm soccer, but with
it,
ants.
yeah, exactly. Swarm soccer, but with ants. And like, and the funny thing was like it became this little microcosm of America, because you'd get these like kids, like the bigger kids would grab like 20 or 30 of the bundles because they were light enough they could carry that many, and they were like hoarding the bundle. There were enough kids probably to go around that each kid could have had like 2 or 3 bundles, but no, these kids are like they were little Elons. They just had to have all of the crumbs, and like they were trying to help out by like hoarding the stuff, and like they knew where to take it and then to drop it down, and so it was pure chaos. Like someone had like them put their baby in the middle of it all just to take some Instagram photos. Like it was everything that is wrong with America today in the form of children trying to move little pillows around. And the ants would come along and they would try and do their little work. And they'd like, they'd line up a couple things and they'd pass the crumbs back and forth to each other. And they were like modeling the behavior. And then the kids would just kick things. But I went away and came back. And when I came back, I noticed that some lines had really formed. So like just the sheer persistence of the ants going about their business does seem to like ultimately lead to something like what they're trying to get to. But just in the level of accidental social commentary, this was delightful. Plus also those kids were having a blast. The
Right,
parents having, bags being thrown at them full force at their face, maybe not as much.
Well, we talk a lot about play, and this really seems to encompass some element of that like makes its way to immersive theater too, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Proud of us for not making a Zoolander reference that segment. So we made a few of them as we were prepping. So we made it.
I'm trying to be good. It'll happen.
All right. So now we're going to talk about a few other shows that maybe didn't work quite as well as the public performances here. So I think, Laura, you're going to lead off with Somnium by the Roisin Box Project.
I think it's Rosen, if I remember correctly from the announcements.
Putting an Irish spin on it, apologies.
So we're going to segue into ticketed performances. And by ticketed, I mean, like, again, these were, I think everything, Noah, correct me if I'm wrong, everything that was not free was $20 per
$20,
show.
exactly.
Yeah.
Blanket.
So,
and also just to know, like, we are going to talk about some stuff that worked as well. So just like if you're listening to the episode and you made stuff and you're like, wait a second, our show's on this part, don't worry.
Right.
You don't know what we think yet.
Right. Yeah, so we're going to start with Somnium. I was really excited for this. So this was billed as it's an originally choreographed dance with projection mapping and music to create a fully immersive multisensory experience. And these are Rosen Box Project, also local San Diego artists. And I think this is where we start to get into, not to like split hairs, but where there are some issues around the limitations of like Liberty Station. This was between buildings and they need to partition off certain spaces. So you've got COVID. This is outdoors, probably in large part for COVID. And it was at night because of the projection mapping. But then in order to partition off this space, there's no raked element. So the stage isn't raked, and likewise, the audience isn't in a raked formation. And Noah and I both caught this performance, and I have some concerns around how, and we talk a lot about it, No Pro, trying to bring in new audiences. And we talk a lot about the like nomenclature, the vernacular, like how do people know what they want to experience? How do they know what some of these things mean, which are some of these, the terminology is evolving. And to me, there were projections, there was not projection mapping, which,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The difference here is that, so you have these dancers, and I just want to say right off the bat, I actually loved the soundtrack for this performance. And I thought the choreography was stunning. I thought the dancers were incredibly skilled. So a lot of great things about this performance. But you've got dancers on a, sort of a like a padded, essentially dance floor outside.
Yes, it's a flat pergo floor that's been like plopped down in a parking lot.
Right. And then there's a backdrop, which then it's mostly just behind them, like you would see in a proscenium theater. They did add in another side. So you've kind of got this V shape that's off kilter. This did not feel immersive. Again, it felt more traditional proscenium. And then the projections were sometimes kind of over the dancers, mostly behind them. But the projection mapping would be in response to their physical beings. And in this case, with the exception of, I think, one moment, like one segment, the projections were not reactive in any way to the dancers themselves. So they would have looked exactly the same had the dancers not been there.
Yeah,
And
I caught this like I think the day before the night before you did, and like I went in and I sat down in the back, and like because it was just flat on the ground, the dance floor, and the audience flat on the ground. Which look, it's not impossible to have that set up when you're doing a dance concert, but it is already makes things very difficult. And then depending on how the choreography is, can make it impossible to tell what's going on if you're not in the front two rows. I was in like the 7th or 8th row. I do this intentionally because I want to see how things play to the back of the room. Like when I go to a proscenium show, I'm that guy. I'm like, oh, okay, get to the back of the house. Let's see what you can do here. And it was illegible. I couldn't tell what the dancers were doing because all I was seeing was, the top halves of their bodies. And the stuff that was being projected, I couldn't tell if there was, like a connect or something like that, like going on. Like I couldn't tell if things were being synced up. It looked to me like there were digitized recordings of previous versions of the performances being displayed behind them, creating kind of like a 4-bit, 8-bit monochrome visual scape. But it was illegible from where I was sitting, so I left after 10 minutes because that was clearly not how it was intended to be presented.
And strangely, and so I'll say, just to clarify a little bit, or to say a little bit more about the projections, there were some projections, which again, actually, I thought were on their own. I thought they were really lovely. And I thought that they were cohesive with this performance in terms of how I interpreted it. It was not projection mapping. So there were sort of these like kind of abstract outlines, very sort of Tron-like, and it offered a lot of movement, but it was not projection mapping. So I do think that the way that we're presenting and marketing this information, that was a big reason actually why I chose this performance and was building, as I mentioned before, the rest of my schedule around some of these, kind of anchor shows, or they were anchors for me. I sat in the front and had a different experience in that I want to say, like, I think we've done a really great job holding space for all of these creators and producers during COVID. And people have pivoted with incredible speed, and there has been some just phenomenal work that has come out of this time. I do think that overall, a lot of people have been very critical, and I would argue even hypercritical, around digital productions and the tech. And if let's say the tech doesn't fully work, something goes wrong with Zoom, etc. I think if we are going to hold digital productions to that standard, we need to also consider what are our expectations around in-person physical experiences. Because to me, I sat in the front to the side. When the music started, I was right near a speaker. And the positioning of the speaker, the height it was set at, the angle, etc., and then the volume, and this is an outdoor performance, it was deafening.
Oof.
And I actually had my partner and I both carry earplugs with us because of, concerts. We know this. We know to be prepared. I put in my earplugs. I couldn't take it. So I actually got up after like 5 minutes and I stood in the back.
Oh, wow.
Because it was overwhelmed. The sound was so deafening that it was uncomfortable.
Yeah, and almost certainly one of the reasons why the sound was cranked up so much was because it's running simultaneous to Laboul, which I don't think we're going to get a chance to touch on, but was really beautiful. But while it's running opposite Laboul, there's maybe a fireworks show happening that was happening the night I saw it, like across the thing. There are the planes going overhead,
Right.
which at a certain time it's like every 5 minutes there's a jet. And then on Saturday night, there was also a wedding reception happening, 15 yards past where Laboul, which was 20, 30 yards away from the backdrop of Somnium. So it all adds up to a sonic mess. And the thing about this particular performance is that it didn't need to be outside.
Right.
And indeed, it probably would have been better served in one of the spaces in the facility that had the dance floor and had raked seating. Although then it might like sort of toss into question like how is this any different from like a standard dance concert with projections going on behind it,
Well, and I think
that gets
into
that whole like, is it projection mapped? Is it using the technology? Is there an interplay here? Is it advancing? Is it experimental in any way? And then
right. And I do think that brings, but if having it outside, I think that this comes back to, and I think we'll move on after this, but I do think we talk a lot about intentionality. We talk a lot about different limitations in terms of experience design and how that can push you into really great directions, or it can kind of take you down maybe a path you didn't want to go down. And I do think that in this case, if that was one of the key drivers behind it, having it outside, and how did that introduce certain considerations, to me, the cons far outweighed the pros. And I think that it's, it just did not seem like the intentionality was there in terms of this as a fully cohesive production, especially being billed as immersive.
Yeah.
Before we move on, was this wedding part of the festival?
No.
How is it in the middle of all these shows?
Because Stone Brewery has that bocce ball court right off the lip of their thing that's their territory, and they rented it out that night. As is their want and right to do. There was another wedding reception happening in another space over next. There was multiple wedding receptions happening on Saturday night, and that has everything to do with the fact that there was an entire year where no one got married.
Well, but I think that Kevin's identified a potential market opportunity for have your wedding embedded in some sort of immersive festival.
Yeah. Oh, let me tell you, I want to see 4 weddings and a funeral as an immersive show.
With actual live weddings.
With actual live weddings. Yes. Maybe an actual live funeral too.
maybe a live funeral.
And I'm mostly facetious about that, but I am starting to think about like how cool it would be to just be like, Wedding Crashers the show, as it were.
Speaking of funerals and how you might commune with the dead, Black Seance. Nailed it.
Okay, you do not nail a segue if you say nailed it after saying it really quickly. It's not how that works, Kevin.
It is.
All right. I'll take this on. So Black Seance is a piece produced this year by the Blind Spot Collective, who are no strangers to Without Walls. They produced a really fantastic piece. The last one that was all up at the high school and was just absolutely fun and super dynamic. This one comes from a couple of LA-based artists, so they've come down to San Diego. Writer director Richard Allen, and in the performer here is Nathan Nonhoff. This piece. They have transformed one of the spaces inside Liberty Station into a speakeasy style bar. That called Black Séance, that is filled with all these portraits of figures from Black American history. Despite the fact that this is not an actual speakeasy bar and it's still very much a theater space, I feel like they did a pretty good job of evoking the vibe of a little hidden away bar. But one that was really meant as a performance space. So kind of like what I would put into the site evocative category of spaces. The structure of this piece, the conceit, is that our lead character is a young man who is an adoptee, and he's trying to connect with a sense of the past, connect with his roots. And one of the mechanisms for this is that here at Black Séance, he does in fact get possessed by the spirits of his forerunners. This requires the performer to go through a series of characters, channeling, if you will, these historical personages. And the whole piece, there's a couple little breaks inside of it, which mostly there to give the performer a break. But they aren't full intermissions, and it's kind of an extended one act that goes for a little over an hour. There's some pretty meaty stuff in the writing. There's a couple of passages in the piece that I thought were particularly potent, and you can really feel the writer director. There's a lot on his mind. There's a lot coming through. In fact, I think that there's too much being put into this piece. There's a lot kind of put in there in a way that feels breathless at times. One of the one of the core parts about directing in theater, as I understand it, is it's all about crafting the segues, transitions from scene to scene, but also from moment to moment. And the way this was structured, and the way the piece was directed, there were some times when the performer was given the chance to create a moment of transition from his base character to the person he was channeling. And indeed, you could go the wrong way with this. You could make it very corny if you overplayed it. But there were also plenty of times when it just felt like a channel switching on television. He was just, the character was here 1 second and gone the next, and there was no sense of a relationship between the lead character, and all of it's structured in a way that makes it feel like it feels like it's supposed to be autobiographical, but it's not. These are all fictional, or at least the main character might be a version of a real person, but it's not. It's definitely not the performer's actual name. Something Baker is the character's name, and I can't remember right now. So he might be playing a version of somebody, but there's a lot of fictional elements, and it starts to kind of evoke some of the current trend in like shows with magicians where they're being confessional. But it's artifice, and despite the fact that there's some moments that I think are real highs, there's just so much going on, and in a lot of ways too much being asked. It's a difficulty 9 setup to have a performer go through all these characters, and I think there's a reason why your Anna Devere Smiths are once, maybe twice in a generation figures, because there's only so many performers, and they usually are solo performers, who can be take on so many dimensions. It's a real craft, and it usually does come out of a writer performer, and that's not the setup that's going on here. And the other thing is that I think this doesn't work as an immersive staging, not because they're not using the space, but because the piece doesn't need to be staged this way. Mm-hmm. And I think would actually be stronger if they had some more artifice, so that you didn't have to have the script characters wouldn't have to stop and identify themselves because, maybe the audience couldn't pick up on the contextual clues as to who they were. Although sometimes they don't. But there's things that are being done in the script that just feel kind of clunky that could maybe be done with super titles or could be done with a more traditional theatrical setup. As it is, it often just feels kind of super performative. That's the other thing. This is a performance, and performance and immersive aren't diametrically opposed, but they're always in tension. And the weight of this really does lie in the performance. And I just don't think it works as an immersive.
Mm-hmm.
But that's me.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with all of that. I will say this was the particular production that I was thinking of when I said, as we're talking about Monuments, and I was like, Monuments does something really, really well, and it is not trying to check off every box. I do think that this is trying to do way too much. The performer, whose name is Nathan Nonhoff, has a beautiful singing voice.
Really
And
beautiful. Yeah.
there were two moments where he and very different types of music and performance in that regard. I was absolutely captivated in those moments. But I think that so some of the Black icons that are channeled are Frederick Douglass, Josephine Baker, James Baldwin, Eartha Kitt, Red Fox, and I did spend, I think, too much time as you're talking about, like, how is this staged? How is it contextualized? What are these segues? And I spent way too much time trying to figure out who this was. Sometimes it was a little bit more obvious. But I spent too much time trying to figure out who this sort of main core character, Francis, who he's channeling. There's this whole magician aspect. Yes, it does provide a through line, but it feels very weak to me. And it added a layer that didn't deepen my relationship to the material. I totally agree. This did not need to be staged the way that it was staged. And to me was actually, because I was kind of up front in the middle, there were times where I would have had to completely physically turn around in this awkward kind of this couch that seemed to absorb me.
Yeah.
I mean, really, I sat down and I was like, oh, I will never leave.
I was seated in the same creche as you initially, but because of where the seats were, they like came over and like, oh, could you make sure you tuck in like right here? And I was just like, oh, is there somewhere else I can sit? Because like, I'm not going to sit. I was practically sitting on top of someone, which also felt really strange. I'm like, you're going to make me sit on top of someone I don't know? Like these days, that feels weird. So I abandoned that seat, and like, there were plenty of empty seats in the back. So I don't know why they even had those two seats there necessarily. It was a very odd choice. And also like, I felt like I never feel number one thing people worry about with immersive is they're like, oh, they're not going to call on me and put me on stage, are they? And I feel like this show was doing that. Like it was participatory theater in that sense. And that is something that a lot of people have a hard nope on. And it is rare when I'm that stressed out about it, but I could feel like, oh, I'm in center stage. Everyone's going to be seeing how I react.
Right.
I got to get out of here. I got to get out of this space. And also it was just like too tiny. So yeah.
I also think that, so I think also, and this is, I'm going to get really granular for just a second. So, and I realize that we can't just like, include an image in the, in this recorded audio segment. But the other thing that actually really threw me was, again, sort of more on the marketing side. And I don't know where the responsibility really falls, if this is more on the Black Seance production team, if this is more on the La Jolla Playhouse team. But the photograph that was used for Black Seance to me, had a very different tone than the show did. This image is of this performer, and it's from profile. It's a black background. and he is not wearing a shirt. He has this very what I would imagine as he has a very decorative like bib necklace on. There's kind of a headset. He's got this jewelry, this very evocative jewelry. And it feels to me what I would imagine more as kind of a like New Orleans, very mystical, very spiritual vibe. And that is not the tone of the show that we saw. And
Yeah.
so I also think that whether this falls more onto the, creator side, the production team of the festival, kind of, however much they might have input as they are lining up the programming, looking who they want to invite or screening productions, to me, there was a real disconnect between what I'm going off of, again, the information that's being presented to me. And then I showed up and it felt like this is not at all how it seemed to come across through the marketing materials.
So I can tell you, because I was looking up some stuff earlier today. So that image, and Nathan, that is Nathan in profile, but he's been like Photoshop painted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is, if I read my Facebooks right, that is an image that was created by or with the writer director, had a direct hand in that particular image. And I've seen another version of that image where you see Nathan in head on, and half of him is that way and half of him is how he appears, not in the show, but just like 21st century Nathan. And so it's a different take on the idea of, this is someone's, like the self, as he would be in like or the selves that exist within him, right? Like there is a thematic consistency to what's being done there. But yes, tonally, the show opens with a bunch of dad jokes and some magic tricks that I don't think were actually pulled off, but everyone clapped for. Like, there was a thing he was doing, I was like, oh, but I don't think he did it. And people were clapping, and it was very weird. I was like, are we just not going to, he didn't actually tie the things? Are we going to just act like he did? Like, what's going on, everybody? And they were dad jokes. It was, I think they were trying to like break the ice and like set everybody at ease, but instead it actually put me on edge, because I was like, oh, it felt very, it just didn't feel.
No, it felt like a cabaret, and it didn't feel at all to me like a seance. And there's not anything wrong with it being a cabaret, but or again, kind of a cabaret vibe for what you're describing, like a kind of solo.
It's just kind of like what your expectations are, like.
Right. And it doesn't say
both the shows you've kind of brought up as ones that didn't work as well did tie back into the way they set the expectations for you too. It seems like that's been a major point of kind of why they may not have worked, because Laura, I'm as someone really looking at the website and trying to understand these shows, the Black Seance certainly seems like it would present in a different way than how it's been described. Like,
yes,
and the physical space. I gotta say, the physical space when you walk in, like, I think did present that way, right? Like, visually, what we were being told, and it not necessarily like, ooh, mystical, and like you're going to like there's a really bad way that could go, right? But it again, like, it didn't feel like we were being taken on a journey, and it felt a lot more like something you might see, like at a magic show, like something you might see at the Magic Castle or Black Rabbit Rose, and that's fine. And I think they could have actually leaned into their framing more that way. So yeah, ironically enough, the show has a bit of an identity crisis, so like meta-textually, okay. But I do think that undercuts some of the real strengths of the writing, the real strengths of the questions being asked, and the strengths of the performer. The things aren't, and that's a function of there being so much being put into this one.
Mm-hmm. Yep, totally agree.
All right, so now we're going to head on to a show that Laura saw, and this is actually the third part of a series that she has seen and talked about the first two parts of. So that's 1,000 Ways Part 3 and assembly. I'm just gonna kick it to you, Laura, to talk all about this series in the show.
Yeah, and I'll make this one a bit more concentrated. So, A Thousand Ways is a triptych, and this is by an experimental theater duo called 600 Highwaymen. The first one was A Thousand Ways Part 1, a phone call, and this was exactly what it sounds like. This was audio only over the phone. Part 2 was called An Encounter, and that was a two-person physical, in-person experience. And then this was A Thousand Ways Part 3, an assembly. And it was, just like it sounds, a group experience, also in person. So you have these three different levels in terms of how you're experiencing them, who you're experiencing them with. The through line for all three thematically is around connection, especially during this incredibly difficult time. And the sort of mechanical through line is that this is participant driven, but 600 Highwaymen have created really incredible infrastructure. And so over the phone for part 1, it was this kind of AI, I believe, pre-recorded voice. There's some debate still. I don't know that 600 Highwaymen have actually said, or at least with people I've chatted with, there still is a little bit of debate. But anyway, there was a guide. There was this audio guide, whether that was pre-recorded or an actual performer. And then with part 2 and part 3, you're going off of cards. So it's these note cards with instructions. And what's really interesting about the way these are presented, and I'll actually read the sort of blurb for this. So an assembly brings together an audience of 12 strangers to construct a unique and intimate theatrical event. Using a shared script, an evocative story of perseverance comes into focus, tracing how we consider one another individually and collectively after so much time apart. So you do not have to have done all three of these experiences, either just or you don't have to have done them all in the same order. I mean, there's a lot of fluidity here, and I do think that it's one of the testaments to 600 Highwaymen and their brilliant design. That said, this was my least favorite of the three experiences. And I think that is, in a weird way, a kind of compliment, because part 1 and part 2, I thought, were so brilliant and so transformative. I think that my expectations might have just also been kind of unreasonable for part 3. So I think there's, there's a little bit of an issue there, that they're so good at what they do that then my expectations were magnificently high. Here's where I think we've got a kind of, again, a festival issue. And then I'll speak briefly about like the design itself. One thing that I think that was problematic about, and I don't think it's just Liberty Station. No, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. The wayfinding of the signage, in my opinion, was very, very lacking. And I felt this way before. A Thousand Ways Part 3 was actually my very, very last experience of the weekend. And I did have some trouble locating some of the other performance spaces. There were some, like 40 Watts from Nowhere and Black Seance, where they had signage taped up on windows. They had different booths directing you to the check-in booth. They did a fantastic job kind of covering all bases. They also had a color-coded map, digital map, but it lacked the actual street addresses. And they had color-coded umbrellas outside on the lawns and whatnot.
Oh, that's what those umbrellas were for. I didn't pick up on that.
Well, but so what's interesting is that, again, when you're really, and I am being granular, I am being very specific, but if you've just got color coding, you're potentially creating an issue for people who are colorblind. I really needed some of the physical addresses in a more immediate way. And then there needed to be more signage. And this leads me to, there was an elderly couple, really lovely people. they were in our Thousand Ways performance and had not registered for it. They were very confused, it seemed, and grew increasingly confused over the course of the experience. And it actually did impact the end of the experience as well.
How
And
did they
so,
wind up in it if they weren't supposed to be part of it?
right. So this had no signage outside the building. It did have the umbrellas. It had no signage on the ground floor. And again, my partner and I kind of wandered around. We asked somebody who didn't know. And then we saw someone with a WOW t-shirt, and they sent us in the correct direction, which was on the second floor. And there was a booth or a table. And we checked in, and they, have their highlighter and the list, and they crossed off our names. Fantastic. I don't know how this couple wound up in the room. I wasn't there during that part, so I don't know exactly what transpired there. But I do think that there just were many opportunities in terms of wayfinding and signage and other festivals that I've either participated in or I've been to. And I actually read something online that said for this year, they thought the wayfinding and signage, a critic thought it had really improved. And I found that really surprising. So there's always going to be things that you cannot plan for in terms of, immersive theater, especially, or just any production, specifically immersive theater, and specifically immersive theater like this, where it is really driven by the participants. That being said, it actually had a huge impact on the ending, and it really deflated the experience for me. And I don't mean that as an unfair criticism of this couple, but they were frustrated, and it wound up permeating into.
Why did they stick with it? Do you know?
Also,
Do
Well,
you have any sense?
One more question.
And are we sure it
to
wasn't a
answer
bit?
So looking at it says it's only for 12 people, and it looks like there's only 12 seats. Did that throw it off as well?
So actually, that's a really good question, and I think you've actually nailed it. There were 4 rows of 4 chairs. So it wasn't just 12 people, it was 16 in our case. And it did fill up. And so I don't know exactly what happened with, if they had a wait list, or because I know there were other people that were trying to get into the 1,000 Ways performances and couldn't because it was sold out. The volume changed, the capacity changed for the show. And I wonder, yes, Kevin, if that maybe contributed to this, like, this hiccup. It was not a bit. They genuinely were wound up pulling out some papers at the end, and they were asking my partner and I questions about where they should go, and they were trying to find this other show that they were supposed to be in. And so it really wasn't a bit. And they were, because at the end of the performance, you are taken outside. This was an elderly couple. They needed to use the elevator. They were not stable on their feet. They needed extra time. And so, again, you want always to have inclusive options. And this particular group of people really made an effort to include them. And we did. But I think
it sounds like, that they weren't supposed to be there, and that somebody pulled an audible at the check-in desk, and like, just, and should be told, like, look, that's often being run by volunteers. That could have just been a volunteer fail.
Sure.
Totally. Things definitely happen, right? Like with Laboul, like the night before, there wasn't a wedding reception. The audio was fine, right? Mm-hmm. Like, this is one of the issues with being in these spaces. Like, there's always going to be something that happens. But it does sound like, I am kind of surprised that someone said, like, oh, the wayfinding is a lot better. Like, the map worked well, but like, there weren't really big bold signs in places to, like, they just weren't. So I don't know what that person was talking about. Like, I spent a lot of time when I first got there, just kind of like going about and figuring out where everything was. And like, by the second day, I was confident in terms of my wayfinding. But this sounds like this was like totally hidden.
And I think that the larger point here, because I don't want to drill down on something that's just, again, it's a total accident. It's, hopefully an anomaly. But I think what's interesting here from a production standpoint on the festival's behalf, because 600 Highwaymen can't be anticipating every possible space that this would be produced in. But if you are going to have as part of the design that then this group leaves the space together and goes to a different space, in this case, it was outside, like on the lawn of this building. And you are continuing the experience there. That needs to be taken into consideration by the festival's production team. And again, perhaps there just wasn't a large enough space on the ground floor. But there are issues where I'm just kind of wondering how some of these decisions were made, because even, let's say this couple, they absolutely were supposed to be there. Let's just say that. The people with mobility aids, like, you have to consider, how does that impact then the experience if we're going to require that people start this on the second floor and then get down to the first floor and get down outside on a lawn. So I do think that there are worthwhile elements to consider for producers of a festival like this. And when you're going to include a production like this, and consider, what do we really need for the space in order for this to work? And in this case, I really don't think that was taken into consideration, or at least not enough.
And that's one of those things that comes up in immersive a lot, in terms of like something like Delusion, or where transversal is really important to how you're moving through a show, and you wouldn't think about it with one like this. And maybe that's just what happened is, they didn't think about, we are moving participants, and that needs to be factored into the actual show.
Yes. And I will say that the other thing about the design itself, so again, there was this hiccup, which I do think was very informative for me. It did not feel great in terms of how it impacted the experience in the moment. Those are always informative moments that I think there are larger takeaways, and those can be very helpful to consider. In terms of the design, I think that the thing that you run up against in a production like this is one that we've talked about in all sorts of other contexts. You cannot control how the participants will react. And I think that there were people who, in a way, I think what this production did so brilliantly was that there were people that stepped in, or kind of took over, or projected other things into the space or onto the other participants in a way that it didn't go against the design. They were following the card's instructions, but it resulted in a much more, in my opinion, kind of awkward flow and awkward exchange. Whereas part one and part two, because you're dealing with just two people together, you can really get into a kind of sync. And I talked about this with part one. It seemed like my fellow participant, he didn't really want to be there. And I wasn't even really sure what to do in the moment. I thought, oh gosh, this guy, like, this is frustrating. Like, I wish he were enthusiastic and wanted to be here. And yet we wound up getting there together. And that process was really amazing. And that was something that I took away that was profoundly fulfilling. But when you have an entire group, it can become very difficult to get in sync. And yet, I think because 600 Highwaymen really knows what they're doing, that then embodied ultimately the sort of lessons and really like heart of the piece. It wasn't as fulfilling to me as the two other productions, but I do think it achieved, from what I understand the intention to be, or what I'm interpreting the underlying intention to be.
Okay, great. It's a good update. I think it's a good discussion on how shows can change in sizing up too, and like changing the format.
Yeah.
So now we're going to jump onto the last show, and this is actually the one I'm most excited to hear about. From Mr. and Mischief. They were the ones that put on Escape from Godot, which is run in a few places. I love that show. So I was a little sad that 49 Watts from Nowhere was not based in LA, but you two got to experience it. I want to
Well,
hear all about it.
Well, from a certain point of view, it is based in LA.
Yay.
So this is a piece of docu-theater about Sue Carpenter, who created KBLT, a pirate radio station in Silver Lake back in the 90s. It is based on her book. This is freaking brilliant. And I made sure we saved this one for last because I want to go out on a high note because I knew we had some stuff to like kind of, tackle. So this is the treat at the end of, kind of a rough one. Here's how it works. It requires 5 people, and you meet a woman who introduces herself as your best friend, and you are now Sue Carpenter, and she takes you into the building. She gives you everybody gets a pair of headphones because what DJ doesn't have a good pair of headphones, and all of them are tuned to a local feed. You are then told to like go on in, and you find a room that is set up to look like your apartment, Sue, and one of the doors in your apartment leads to a closet, and that closet is KBLT. It is the broadcast center, the DJ booth, and the beautiful, beautiful record collection on both CD and vinyl of KBLT. And the piece progresses through a series of audio cues, some of which you set up by playing the proper CD, others of which unfold because what you quickly find out is that, and this is a little bit spoilery, I'm sorry, but there's no way to talk about the whole thing without this little bit, that the narrator you're hearing in your headphones is in fact live and is guiding you through the story and telling you the story while you were in the space. There are certain things, Laura, I'm gonna see if I can code here so you know what I'm talking about without it spoiling for Kevin, but there's certain little details about what the narrator's saying when you do certain actions that I don't want to reveal for folks, but just know that everything you are encountering is live and on the air with you at that moment. And yeah, there's the turntable and there's the CD player, and like you're tasked with like keeping the station on air. Like they're told don't let there be any dead air. This triggered all of my old radio station instincts, and so I became very obsessed with us never hitting dead air and making sure things were going. And there's you can dig through the CD collection and find the next thing to play and the vinyl, and you got to kind of go back and forth between the two if you actually want to keep the dead air from happening. So you got to queue up the vinyl, and like there was no monitor headphones, and that was hard, but so I did it anyway. And I sort of like jumped in full force into that part, but I also made sure that like everyone, like I was telling people like bring me your thing and like get on the microphone and you announce it, and I was touching the controls because that's my jam. And then the story is great. You get this whole story narrated, and you're kind of going through the motions of Sue's life. You're all, taking a page out of Sue's life and living part of it for a moment. Just an amazing piece that uses the language of escape games and themed entertainment to do something entirely novel. And there's only one quibble I have with it, and I'll toss it to Laura to kind of let her play with it for a moment.
This was hands down my favorite piece out of the whole weekend, and just on its own, I thought it was really incredible. And Kevin, I think there may be some movement at some point for it to be staged here in LA. So hopefully
they're going to do what they can, Kevin. You're going to be okay.
Yeah. So I hope
I jump on that as soon as I can.
I'm kind of saying it out loud, like hoping that like, yes, this is going to happen and people in LA will get to experience this. It was truly immersive. The design was impeccable. It raises so many elements around things that we discussed. The liveness, as Noah's saying, that added such an important element to it. There are moments where you can do your own thing. You can explore the record collection. It can feel very nostalgic. You do work together at times. You're all Sue Carpenter, but you also have moments where you may have your own kind of specific role. there are other live moments that happen not just through the narration. So it is, and I spoke with Jeff Crocker, who is half of the Mr. and Mischief duo, briefly afterwards, and I thought he raised a really wonderful point that in immersive theater there is a lot that tends to lean on the fantasy end of the spectrum. We've got Alice in Wonder, utilizing kind of source material from Alice in Wonderland or from Shakespeare, and these really kind of fantastical worlds, and not as much on the documentary side. And so, and I don't know if we already mentioned this, but this is based on Sue Carpenter's book, 40 Watts from Nowhere. I think it's a journey into pirate radio. And it's a fantastic story that now when we talk about extending experiences, now I'm planning to read that, and I would love to potentially do this experience again with different people. And so I think that there are layers to the design that work incredibly well on their own as a contained experience. And then also by extension, you get to dive into the story, real history, and learn more. And I think that I think Jeff is absolutely right. I mean, I think the opportunity to have more historical based experiences on that kind of doc side is a huge opportunity. And I hope that we see more of that in the future.
And it's definitely something that, can be, delicate, right? There's been, I think, some attempts made in the past that have been ham-fisted, or maybe even, well-intentioned, but doesn't quite go the way you think. This one, they had an important part, they had the cooperation of Sue Carpenter. And in fact, Sue came to one of the shows, and that was the one I was in.
So cool.
Apparently brought her college-aged kid, and so their kid got to live in their mom's shoes for a minute, which is kind of a rad idea. And yeah, like I think that's a big note right there, right? If you're going to do something where you're sort of doing docu-theater, like make sure that the stakeholders are directly involved. If you're going to be putting people into someone else's shoes. I think the one thing I don't want to leave, I don't want to feel like we're treating Mr. Mischief with kid gloves here. There was one sequence in the middle that I felt kind of just went on a little long, and I honestly don't know if that's because we were waiting on one of the other Sues to like accomplish something that they weren't accomplishing, or what. And Laura, we can maybe trade notes afterwards about that, and get into the nitty-gritty details. But it felt like it was just kind of going on forever. And at the beginning of it, it was this kind of like great explosion of energy, and it was like really different, and it felt like it captured a cinematic montage in an interesting way. But it also felt like it was like a minute and a half, maybe even 2 minutes too long, because at a certain point, everyone was like, "Oh." It got to a point where I was like, did we do something wrong? Is there something, did we miss something? And given how well the show moves and how much the show gives you emotional agency, but not really narrative agency, like you're not doing escape room stuff. But you're moving through the space like you might through an escape room. I think that's where it could tighten up a little bit. Just keeping people moving through. What a great piece.
I had one question because I've seen them on Instagram kind of posting like the songs played at each session, which seems like it's different.
Yes.
And if it's not too spoilery, can you kind of get into like a little bit about how that works? Just I'm curious.
Oh, I mean, it's really simple. Okay. I said at the beginning, you're in a radio station booth. There's a bunch of vinyl. There's a bunch of CDs. You're DJing, man.
Oh,
you're Sue Carpenter. You're DJ. You're DJing. You got to announce the songs. You got work to do. You got to keep that station going.
Okay.
So that's why the songs are all different. It's because you're picking the songs.
What songs did you guys pick?
Well, some of them got picked by, I tried to make sure everyone got a turns, but like, I got some Bowie in there, got the Clash in there. God, what are some other stuff other people chose? Oh Lord, I can see like the albums. Oh, got some Prince in there.
I was completely fixated on getting the Pixies in there, my all-time favorite band. And so I had a singular mission in terms of the choice I made. So
there was a lot of great like albums like in that thing, and there was some weird stuff. There was
there
like
was some really weird stuff. Yeah.
There's Leonard Nimoy's like vinyl of like Leonard Nimoy sings all these like standards and stuff. Like we almost played one of that.
Yeah, it looked like they had an Ultraman vinyl in there.
Yeah, there
too.
was an Ultraman vinyl in there. I was very curious about it, but I wasn't going to blow one of my song slots on what is this thing, not on my shift, mister.
There were some chipmunks that actually worked their way into our group.
I would have put that on if I could have turned the speed of the turntable down, because if you turn Chipmunks tracks from like 70, like you down below, right? Like if you can find some Chipmunks 78s and put them on 33 1/3, you like they're amazing. They are amazing.
Okay, we definitely didn't get that sophisticated.
Well, the turntables in Audio Technica, it is completely great. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't have like the option to like set things below 33 1/3. So
I do want to also just shout out that the performers were absolutely wonderful. So again, there's the liveness that worked beautifully, that was just implemented so wonderfully. And so there has to be some flexibility, and there's some improvising that happens. And our performers did not miss a beat. They were wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
It's scary. It's almost scary. I don't want to say more than that. I don't want to say more than that because it starts getting spoilery. Because it's all about the experience. Like that's the thing. This thing is an experience. Like you get the story, you understand Sue, you understand what that moment was like because you lived it for a second. And there's everything they do is in service of that, and that's amazing.
Yeah, agreed.
And I mean, I think that seems very much in line with what they did with Escape from Godot too, where it's so focused and like
this is even more focused.
Cool. Oh,
like this is even more focused, and it's more focused. It's more controlled. It's more like a dark ride than it is like an escape room, if you will. Sorry, Jeff and Andy, I did go there, but it is definitely more that than the other, and it's lovely.
All right, well maybe it makes its way back to LA. We can talk even more about it, because it sounds like a really cool show.
Yes.
So hopefully I can get to see it at some point. And we're gonna wrap up for today. It's a long one. We covered a lot of stuff, a whole festival worth and more. So thanks Noah, thanks Laura. As always, No Proscenium is a labor of love. Everyone on staff who you hear on podcasts like this and right on the site are volunteers. You can support this work by donating to the No Proscenium Patreon. Even $2 or $5 a month helps. If you're enjoying Review Crew or the main No Proscenium podcast, you can also support us by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts. Thanks, and have a good one.